The BRICS meeting in Kazan, Russia has just concluded. We'll discuss the historic implications of this meeting of 36 countries in this week's China report with Ben Norton. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, KJ Noh. Amanda Yee, my co-host, is out this weekend, but she will be back shortly. First, the headlines. Japan is in turmoil after the ruling LDP party loses the lower house. The Japanese Liberal Democratic Party was trounced in recent polls by an electorate sick of its corruption, shedding over 50 seats and losing its majority in the lower house. This makes the U.S.-aligned militaristic agenda of hawkish Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba harder to implement, including revision of the country's constitution. The LDP has exercised near one-party control of Japan since 1955, when it was created by the U.S. from a coalition of war criminals, corporate bosses, yakuza gangsters, and religious extremists. Rahm Emanuel, U.S. ambassador to Japan, stated that the U.S.-Japan alliance was locked in and that U.S. designs for Japan would remain stable. But other national security experts worry that the sea change in politics could complicate Japan's role as a remilitarized proxy for U.S. war against China in the Pacific. The U.S. seeks to sanction China because it is losing the photonics competition. China is making tremendous investments and breakthroughs in photonics technology, a method that uses light instead of electricity to power semiconductor chips. This new approach could overcome conventional limits in miniaturization, processing speed, and power efficiency, and has the potential to disruptively transform fields such as AI, machine learning, and quantum computing. It would also allow China to bypass and leapfrog U.S. attempts to strangle the Chinese semiconductor industry. The U.S. response from the House Select Committee on the CCP has been to call on the Department of Commerce to investigate Chinese photonic companies in China and to assess the possibility of levying sanctions on them for operating directly contrary to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. According to the committee, silicon photonics represents the next front in our semiconductor competition with the PRC, and the United States is currently not winning this competition. China uses quantum computing to crack RSA encryption. Chinese researchers at Shanghai University have demonstrated that it is possible to break a 22-bit RSA encryption algorithm using a quantum computer. Encryption algorithms based on computational complexity ensure the security of the internet and its communications. The Chinese researchers have published a groundbreaking paper demonstrating that it is possible to break RSA encryption using a novel approach that models prime factorization as an energy optimization problem using a specialized quantum computer. This use of quantum annealing opens the door to other creative ways to crack encryption and accelerates the timeline for quantum disruption of network security. Previously, Chinese scientists had described only the theoretical possibility of breaking RSA encryption using quantum computers. India and China de-escalate tensions along common border. China and India are de-escalating tensions along the Himalayan border, pulling back troops, dismantling dwellings, and withdrawing from two areas where they had previously faced off. This breakthrough came on the heels of a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Narendra Modi on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia. They agreed to boost communications and cooperation to resolve conflict. India, as a key member of the US-led strategic Quad formation, had previously escalated hostility against China, banning Chinese apps, Chinese investment, Chinese joint ventures, and Chinese air flights. However, since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, through the good offices of Russia, it has slowly begun to rebalance back to China. India was severely attacked for refusing Washington's entreaties to sanction Moscow. South Korea sentences 3 police for negligence in crowd crush incident. Today is the second anniversary of South Korea's Itaewon crowd crush catastrophe, where 156 Halloween partygoers were killed and 196 injured. The majority of casualties, young women in their 20s and 30s. 3 police officers were recently sentenced by a Seoul court for negligence in the tragedy. This disaster happened due to a lack of crowd control caused by a total neglect of public safety by the incoming Yoon administration that had assigned former prosecutors and jurists to all key positions. Thousands of police had been diverted to suppress demonstrations against the president that night, whom citizens were protesting due to his suppression of workers' rights and his escalation of tensions with China. The 53rd anniversary of the recognition of China at the UN. On October 25th, 1971, 53 years ago, the 26th session of the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted Resolution 2758 and restored the People's Republic of China as the legitimate representative of China at the UN. This recognized the PRC as the only legitimate representative under international law and expelled the representatives of the Taiwan region who had lost the civil war but who had been illegally squatting China's seat through the collusion of the United States. The resolution resolved the issue of the representation of the whole of China, including Taiwan, in the UN. It established the one China principle that excludes the possibility of 2 Chinas or 1 China, 1 Taiwan. This was reaffirmed in 2007 when UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon declared that in accordance with Resolution 2758, the UN considers Taiwan for all purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China. In the ROC Constitution itself, the Taiwan region is considered a province of China, a part of China's territory. This remains the law, despite contrary assertions by the DPP, the current ruling party, and recent revisionist legislation by the European Parliament. The BRICS group recently successfully concluded its 16th summit in Kazan, Russia. This was a major international event with 36 countries attending and heads of state from China, India, Russia, and South Africa, as well as top leaders from Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, as well as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Here to discuss this with us is Ben Norton. Ben is an investigative journalist and a geopolitical analyst based in Beijing. Ben is also the founder and editor of Geopolitical Economy Report and a highly sought after analyst. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the much too kind introduction.
Thank you, Ben. Ben, the BRICS issued a 134-point Kazan Declaration. This outlined a vast and comprehensive agenda covering development, trade, health, environment, security, culture. And it's also clear from the language of the declaration that this is really the declaration of a counter-hegemonic order. What are some of the key highlights of the summit and the declaration?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. First, I'll just briefly say for people who don't know, BRICS is an organization that was created in 2009 of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then in 2010, South Africa joined. And last year, in the 2023 summit in South Africa, they added 4 new members, which are now Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia has not officially confirmed if it's going to join. And then in this summit this year, 13 countries were admitted as partner countries, which is a step toward joining. So this is a group that's expanding, and it's including more and more of the global South. Now, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned that this is a group that has a counter-hegemonic vision. And I think if people want to understand really what BRICS is, I think one of the best ways to think about it is going back to the Bandung Conference of 1955, in which you had formerly colonized nations that came together, that many of them had very different systems. They had political disagreements, they had economic disagreements, certainly, but they had common points of unity against Western colonialism, against imperialism. And today we can see that essentially BRICS is the global South plus Russia. And Russia has been basically kicked out of the global North and kicked out of the West, right? And at least in the 90s, when the Soviet Union was overthrown, there was a brief attempt by Boris Yeltsin to integrate Russia into the West. And it was made clear that Russia would never be accepted on equal terms. Putin himself, when he came to power, was trying to continue that process. But being a nationalist and believing in Russia's sovereignty, Putin saw that there was no way to integrate into the West on equal terms, that the U.S.-led West would only accept a very subordinated Russia, violating Russia's sovereignty. And because of that, Russia decided that its future lies in economic integration and political integration with Asia as part of a Eurasian process. And BRICS is that platform. So you mentioned the Kazan Declaration. I think this is a historic document because we can see more of what BRICS stands for. At the beginning of the document, they emphasize, this is a 33-page document. It's quite long. They emphasize that they are seeking a multipolar world, one in which there are institutions that are more democratic and accountable, that are not simply dominated by the West. So one of the things they emphasize is that they believe that the United Nations should still be the center of the global order. However, it must be reformed, and the countries of the global South, which are the global majority, because they represent 86% of the world population, they need more representation. And the UN Security Council must be reformed. They called for comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council. This is very important. This has been a demand of the global South for decades, because when the UN was created after World War II, the 5 winners of World War II were given permanent seats in the Security Council. And at that time, that included the Republic of China. This is before the revolution in China in 1949. And a lot of people don't know, it's outrageous that Taiwan, this small island that is part of China, but pretended to govern all of China, they held China's seat at the United Nations Security Council until 1971. So, and then the Soviet Union was the only country that was resisting the Western colonial powers. So the other permanent members of the Security Council are the U.S., France, and the U.K., and they have veto power. Now, of course, that's changed. Now the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation do have veto power. But meanwhile, France and the U.K. have fewer than 70 million people in their population. Meanwhile, a country like India that has 1.4 billion people does not have a permanent seat on the Security Council. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Brazil, these are massive countries with hundreds of millions of people. They don't have permanent seats, unlike France and the UK. So there clearly is a need to reform these institutions. And we all know that the UN was designed in a way so all of the power is concentrated in the Security Council. So this is a very important demand. Now, they also call for reforming other international institutions, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, which control the global financial system. They call for reforming and significantly changing the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The U.S. is the only country with veto power, not only in the IMF, but also in the World Bank. And for the entire history of the IMF and the World Bank, which were created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, that established the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, well, the U.S. was given veto power, and the U.S. has always had the president of the World Bank, has always been a U.S. citizen, and the managing director of the IMF has always been a European. So they control these organizations. The Western powers have vastly disproportionate influence in terms of their vote in these institutions, despite the fact that they now represent a shrinking share of the global economy, whereas BRICS together now represents the original 5 BRICS members together represent 1/3 of the global economy when GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, which accounts for changes in exchange rates of the currencies. They represent 1/3 of the world economy, and now they're expanding. So they're a growing share of the world economy. The BRICS countries represent more than 40% of the population, and now that they're expanding, if you include all of the 13 partner countries, well over half of the world population. And yet they don't have representation in these international institutions. So they call for vastly reforming these institutions. Another very important thing that they mention is they call for peace in Palestine, an end to Israel's bombing of Gaza, a ceasefire. They call for an end to Israel's attack on an invasion of Lebanon. They call for the creation of a Palestinian state. They condemn the Israeli attacks on Iran as violating Iranian sovereignty. They also condemn the illegal U.S. military occupation of Syria for violating Syria's sovereignty. And then finally, I think perhaps the most important part of this document discusses attempts at de-dollarization and creating alternative financial institutions. I've already talked about why there are so many problems with these institutions. Not to mention, I didn't even talk about the fact that the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, have been used for decades to impose neoliberal policies on countries in the global south, formerly colonized countries. So the founding father of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, famously published his book, Neo-Colonialism, in 1965, a year before he was overthrown in a CIA-orchestrated coup. He talked about how political decolonization was not enough. Even though the former colonies had gotten formal independence, they did not have economic independence. And these institutions have been used to violate the sovereignty of these formerly colonized countries and impose neoliberal policies on them in the name of structural adjustment. So this has been a demand for a long time. In fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of the call for the new international economic order, which was issued by the G77, the formerly colonized nations that they created the G77, and the G7 was the colonial alternative, right? The G77 are the formerly colonized nations. The G7 consists of the cartel of colonialist powers that colonize much of the world, right? The G77 for 50 years, which now includes 134 countries. It's no longer just 77, the vast majority of the world population. They have called for 50 years for a new international economic order. And what we're seeing in BRICS are tangible steps to try to create a new international economic order. So in the Kazan Declaration and also in a partner document that was endorsed in the Kazan Declaration, which is a report that was written by the Central Bank and the Finance Ministry of Russia in its capacity as the chair of BRICS for 2024. This is a very comprehensive document that I read, almost 50 pages. Between these two documents, they call for completely transforming the international monetary and financial system, not only challenging the status of the U.S. dollar as the heart of that system, as the global reserve currency, but also creating an alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which the U.S. has used to try to cut off the banks of countries like Russia and Venezuela. They call for the creation of new mechanisms to encourage intra-global South investment. So the countries of the global South are investing in each other and so capital does not flow from poor countries to rich countries, which is often what happens, which is, the opposite of what these bourgeois neoclassical economists say, is that supposedly under capitalism, the idea is that capital would flow from the rich countries to the poor countries. Actually, we see the draining of wealth from poor to rich countries. A recent paper by mainstream economists at the Inequality Lab, the World Inequality Lab, found, in fact, that the 20% richest countries, they have a net drain of capital income from the poor 80% of countries that represents nearly 2% of their GDP. And meanwhile, the poorest 80% of countries, these countries are losing between 2 and 4% of their GDP every year in a drain of capital income that goes from poor to rich countries. So the system needs to be changed, right? Literally, the poor people are helping to make the rich people richer. So what we see internally in a country like the U.S., where the rich get richer and there's more homelessness and there's more poverty, this is also what happens internationally, not just domestically. So that system needs to be changed. They also call for the creation of Yeah, they call for the creation of new institutions that will allow the de-dollarization of bilateral trade between countries. So instead of having to get dollars in order to pay for imports, countries can, in the BRICS and around the BRICS, countries can use their domestic currencies or the currencies of their trading partner, which cuts out the U.S. middlemen. And now, for instance, Russia and China, 95% of their bilateral trade involves Chinese renminbi and Russian ruble. So I could go on. Obviously, this is a complex topic, and I could definitely spend the entire episode, but clearly there are other issues I know you want to address. But I think this is a very historic summit, and it's a major step toward trying to create alternative, not only political institutions, but economic institutions, so that the countries of the global south, the global majority, have more representation, have more of a voice, and have more sovereignty.
Ben, if we read the Kazan Declaration, the title is Strengthening Multilateralism for Just Global Development and Security. So I think that actually, aligns exactly with how you are framing it. But I just want to come back to this notion of unipolarity. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher came out with what has become the mantra of neoliberalism, which is TINA, or there is no alternative. That neoliberal capitalism is essentially the end of history, and there are no alternatives to this. What the Kazan Declaration shows, I think, in the most concrete and specific way possible, is that there is an alternative. And this alternative is actually changing the global geoeconomic structure. But you mentioned a little bit about the mechanisms of de-dollarization and the transformation of the financial system. Can you go into a little bit more about these systems, including, the clear system, the BRICS clear system for cross-border trade, and the reinsurance system, and how that relates to dollar hegemony, and why dollar hegemony is so important for this unequal exchange for the global north?
Absolutely. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that the U.S. empire has a lot of different tools and weapons. Of course, it has this massive military footprint with 800 foreign military bases all around the world. It has a military that spends more than the next 9 largest militaries on Earth combined, or all of the other militaries in the world combined. Those are very powerful tools. The U.S. has propaganda around the world and soft power in the form of media, but also pop culture and Netflix and all that propaganda. But I honestly think the most powerful weapon that the US empire has is the dollar and the dollar system. The international financial system was built in a way that gave the US what's known as the exorbitant privilege, because people everywhere around the world need dollars in order to pay for their imports. It gives the US the ability to print value out of nothing and then to import, to suck in that value from around the world. So workers in Congo need to break their back mining minerals in order to create cobalt and other minerals, right? And then what happens? It gets exported to the United States. The US pays in dollars and can import all of these products that are produced through backbreaking labor. The US doesn't have to do anything. It costs the US nothing to print that money. It used to cost the US maybe like a few cents to print a $100 bill. It no longer needs to print it because the vast majority of dollars and money that exists in the world is digital. It's numbers on a computer screen. So the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, has quite literally printed trillions and trillions of dollars in the past 15 years, especially through the era of quantitative easing. And all of that money, that liquidity, went around the world inflating the value of assets and inflating big bubbles of assets that made the rich much richer in the US and around the world. And meanwhile, people have to break their back. Chinese workers in factories make all of these products. They send them to the US, and the US gives them dollars. And then the US debt grows and grows and grows. But because it can just print the dollars to pay off the debt, it just exports inflation around the world. So if any other country were to try to do what the US did, they would have hyperinflation. They would have crisis. They can't do it. This is the exorbitant privilege. So it's not just that the systems that I talked about, like the IMF and the World Bank, have been used to violate the sovereignty of countries and impose neoliberalism on them, and as a form of what Kwame Nkrumah referred to as neocolonialism. It's not just that. That's certainly part of it. It's also that the U.S. has designed the system in a way so that that capital always flows to the United States, and so that capitalists around the world invest, they hold their wealth, the surplus value they extract from workers, in the form of U.S. assets, in the form of U.S. stocks like Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, the Magnificent Seven, which represent now a majority of the growth in the S&P 500, the biggest 500 companies on the U.S. stock market, the stock exchange. So capitalists around the world invest in U.S. assets and U.S. stocks, also in U.S. bonds, which U.S. Treasuries, that's U.S. government debt, which funds the U.S. government, and it funds the 800 military bases it has around the world. And they invest in U.S. real estate, which inflates the value of houses, which makes it prohibitively expensive for people to get housing in the U.S., which is why there's so much homelessness, because rich people invest in housing, which makes them richer, and then average people can't afford the housing. This is why in China, the government decided to pop the real estate bubble. President Xi famously said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. So the reason I talk about all this is because it's all connected, of course. The dollar system, imperialism, the drain of wealth from the global south. You mentioned unequal exchange, which is also in the form of income deflation, which is where a worker in the US and in Europe who does basically the same exact job as a worker in Latin America, in Africa, in some parts of Asia, if they're a teacher, for instance, they're basically doing the same job. It's not like US teachers are 50 times more productive than a teacher in Zambia, but they're probably paid 50 times more than a teacher in Zambia. I mean, that's that unequal exchange we can see, right? And the reason they can do that is because of imperialism, because of the way that this financial system was constructed in a way that facilitates the extraction of wealth from the formerly colonized countries to the colonizing countries. Now, what can BRICS do? Now, obviously, it can't magically immediately solve all of those problems. This is a very complex, long process, but it's an important step in the right direction. You mentioned how BRICS is showing that there are alternatives to neoliberalism. I agree with you, but it's not just that. Now, of course, BRICS is agnostic about the system of the country. You have socialist systems like China, and now Cuba and Bolivia are joining, and Vietnam is joining, all have socialist systems. You also have monarchies like the United Arab Emirates and Thailand. So, like I said, like the Bandung Conference, which brought together many different systems. These are countries that have different systems, but they're united in a common desire to create alternative institutions that allow countries to pursue their own paths of development. That's what's important, right? This is why multipolarity is so important, because in the unipolar era of U.S. hegemonic domination in the 1990s, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, there was no alternative, because the countries that tried to pursue alternative paths of development, whether it's socialism or some kind of resource nationalism like we saw in Iraq or Libya or Syria, those countries were targeted for destruction. Look at what Cuba and the DPRK have suffered throughout the unipolar era. They tried to pursue an independent path of development, and they were crushed by sanctions and blockades and economic warfare. Whereas Cuba had thrived despite many of the problems, the U.S. blockade and sanctions during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union allowed Cuba to, when there was a separate bloc, not only the Soviet Union, but the countries of the socialist bloc, they traded together. They had deals to help industrialize and to share technicians and doctors. When that system was destroyed and unipolarity was the only option, any country trying to pursue a path independent of U.S.-led neoliberalism was crushed, which is why I always emphasize neoliberalism is not just an ideology. It is a system of political economy that was imposed by the United States. It's the era, the phase of capitalism led by the United States as the global protector of capital in the unipolar era, in which there was no alternative because the structure was designed in a way that prevented alternatives. BRICS is now opening up new possibilities so countries can pursue independent paths. And it says very clearly in the Kazan Declaration that they want countries to be able to pursue their own path. They don't say what that path will be. They're not trying to tell countries. So obviously, we as people on the left want that path to be on the left, away from capitalism, away from neoliberalism, certainly away from monarchism, right? I mean, but the point is that they open up that path. That's what's so important about this. And this is what the detractors and the critics of BRICS don't understand, especially the ultra-left critics who say, oh, well, how can you say that they're challenging imperialism when they have United Arab Emirates as a member, blah, blah, blah. They fail to see how, by opening the space for alternative paths of development, this is what countries in the global south have been demanding for decades. So countries like Cuba and Bolivia and others, as they continue to join, Vietnam, so they can create alternatives, economic alternatives to neoliberalism.
Absolutely, Ben. I mean, I think that the foundational stance of even going back to the Bandung was that states are sovereign and should not be interfered in, and that they have a right to peace and peaceful development. But Ben, let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the other statements that were inside the Kazan Declaration. I mean, there was a strong denunciation of Israel's aggression in the Middle East and a call for a ceasefire. And it also strongly opposed the use of unilateral sanctions as a means of applying political pressure and strong-arming countries into, the designs of Western hegemony. Can you say a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. The statement on Israel was very good. As I said earlier, they called for a ceasefire, an end to Israel's war in Gaza, an end to Israel's war in Lebanon, and the creation of a Palestinian state. They also condemned the Israeli attack in Lebanon as a terror attack involving the pagers. A very strong condemnation there. Which is a horrific weaponization of the supply chain, by the way. I mean, it's absolutely horrific when you think about the Pandora's box that Israel opened by weaponizing civilian technology like pagers and walkie-talkies. And it's also, by the way, very much backfiring. There are reports now of huge increases in orders of technology from mainland China, saying that everything must be produced in mainland China. Because now a lot of people in the global south do not trust any technology created in the West or even potentially involving Taiwan province. The company whose name was on these pagers was a Taiwanese company, although allegedly it was created by Israeli intelligence operatives in Hungary and part of Europe, part of the European Union. But
Ben,
anyway, so
Ben, I
go ahead.
think that's an important point to highlight, is that the company that made the pagers was a company called Gold Apollo, which has been making pagers for decades. But for some reason, and a completely inexplicable way, they licensed their brand to a Hungarian company that has never made anything. And this Gold Apollo company did no QA, they did no quality assurance, they didn't check to see what this company was making or not making. I mean, that strikes me as extraordinary. I mean, when McDonald's licenses its brand, it makes sure that everybody goes to McDonald's University and that everything is done according to McDonald's standards. But for a company that makes pagers, which are much, much more complex than fast food, for them to say that we take our hands off completely, we wash our hands, we had nothing to do with this. Doesn't that strike you as rather strange?
Absolutely. I think it's very suspicious. Of course, authorities in Taiwan claim that they had no knowledge of this, but we know that Taiwanese authorities in their fight with mainland China have been growing closer and closer to Israel and have had meetings, and clearly there's some shady operations going on there. But getting back to what the geopolitical implications are, I mean, what we've seen is that as the US has been imposing more and more sanctions on countries around the world, and now 1/3 of all countries on earth are under US unilateral sanctions. 60% of low-income countries are under US sanctions, according to the Washington Post. The US is creating a kind of new economic iron curtain. And by the way, when we go back to the original Iron Curtain, it wasn't the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc that wanted the Iron Curtain. It was the capitalist West that created it. And once again, they're creating it. And the US is also imposing tariffs on Chinese technologies, very important technologies like electric vehicles, solar panels, semiconductors. The US has export restrictions to try to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced semiconductors as part of what they call what the US is calling a chip war, or at least people in Washington are calling a chip war. And now what we see is that as the US is dividing the global economy, we even see, for instance, a huge development, which is that the British bank HSBC, which has its roots in the Opium War and British colonialism in China, the HSBC has announced that it's actually dividing into HSBC East and HSBC West. So once again, we see that this new Cold War is leading to a new kind of economic Iron Curtain. However, this is very different from the original Iron Curtain, because what we now see is that much of the world's most advanced technology is coming from China. It's not coming from the West. And not just the advanced technology. China produces everything. China alone is responsible for 35%. Mainland China is responsible for 35% of global manufacturing output. When you can include Taiwan province, which is part of China, it's even more. I mean, not to mention South Korea, Japan, and the growing technological capabilities of countries in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, Indonesia, India. So obviously, South Korea and Japan are kind of part of the political West, if you will, which is not a geographic concept. It's a political concept. But the reality is that, as we see the U.S. dividing the global economy in this way, it's actually, in some ways, it's going to probably backfire because, for instance, people in the U.S. can't buy very high quality, cheap electric vehicles. Instead, they have to buy very expensive, crappy Teslas, which might blow up or the wheels might fall off. If you look up, there's a huge problem with all of these, I think they call them wobbly wheels that fall off all the time. Anyway, or like, there are stories of people who can't get out of their Tesla and they fall in water and they suffocate, or there are accidents and they can't get out of the car and they asphyxiate. Anyway, whatever. So the people in the U.S. cannot have good BYDs. They're stuck with Elon Musk's car, so he has a monopoly, which of course he's very happy with. The point is that as the U.S. is dividing the world in this way, in reality, the U.S. is no longer the dominant economic power that it once was. And certainly in the first Cold War, the U.S. economy still had many advantages over the socialist bloc that are no longer true of today. And a system like BRICS shows how many countries in the global South can see which direction the wind is blowing in. And that's why more than 30 countries have applied to join BRICS. That's why it keeps expanding. That's why there's so much interest, even among historic U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates. It's also true that China is the largest trading partner of the majority of countries on Earth. Again, because China produces everything, whereas the U.S. in the neoliberal era has deindustrialized and produces less and less, right? It produces, debt, weapons, drugs, Netflix movies. So in reality, why do we talk about this? Of course, we were talking about the weaponization of the supply chain by Israel. It's only going to backfire even further. And getting back to the Kazan Declaration, they emphasize that the most important thing in this new era is economic security. That countries need to have sovereignty, not just political, but economic sovereignty. And BRICS is trying to find new mechanisms to do that, which involves de-dollarization. It involves trade in local currencies. It involves finding new reserve assets so the United States and Europe cannot steal the reserves of central banks around the world, which is what they've done to Venezuela, billions of dollars of gold and other reserves. It's what they did to Iran, to Afghanistan, and more recently, it's what they did to Russia, involving $300 billion and euros of assets in Russia's reserves. And now countries all around the world have said, wow, if the West can do this to Russia and try to disconnect Russia from the global financial system, Russia is a major power. We're nothing. I mean, we're a tiny, small country compared to them. I mean, this is how a lot of people are seeing it. Like, we're so weak. Russia is one of the world's dominant powers. So all of these policies are related in the sense that US-led Western imperialism is dividing up the world and drawing these lines and saying you're either with us or you're against us. And a lot of countries are saying, fine, if we have to pick a side, we're not going to pick the West. They're picking BRICS.
Absolutely, Ben. And, this is the interesting piece here is that, traditionally the empire has always sought to divide and conquer. But the actions that this administration is taking is actually driving the countries of the global south together, of which, the BRICS is a very strong and concrete manifestation. There are also other groupings, the SCO and the countries aligned with the Belt and Road. But I think it boils down to the fundamental fact that the empire has always traditionally underdeveloped the global south. It needs underdevelopment in the global south. And what this BRICS alliance does is it allows the countries of the global south to ally with each other and develop together mutually, concretely, in a way that has never been allowed before under the US dominated hegemonic system.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what's so important is if you look at BRICS, it's also important to go back and look at the non-aligned movement, right? Because often when we in Western education systems, when we learn about the Cold War, the first Cold War, it's the US-led West, NATO, versus the Soviet-led socialist bloc. Maybe they'll also talk about China a little bit, maybe India. But the rest of the global South, the non-aligned movement is ignored. And if you look at BRICS, you can see a lot of the history going back to the non-aligned movement, which is the global majority, right? Except what's interesting about this is, of course, the non-aligned movement, by definition, the whole point was we're not aligned with the US-led West or the Soviet-led socialist bloc. But now what we actually see is Russia's integration, Eurasian integration, basically into part of the global South. I mean, economically, we see that its economy actually has a lot of similarities with global South economies. And what we've seen is that the United States has tried to take this policy of dividing these countries, right? So exacerbating tensions and conflicts. An example of this is India, right? India is one of these countries like Turkey that's trying to play both sides. And India has very good relations with the US, especially the very right-wing government right now of Narendra Modi. When India originally joined the BRICS, it was under a center-left government of the Congress Party, but it has still stayed active in BRICS. Although India is also part of the so-called Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And they say that it's not an anti-China group, but everyone knows it's an anti-China group. However, India and China, right before this summit was held in Kazan, they signed a historic deal solving their border dispute. This is very important because the US has been encouraging more tensions between China and India. And China, in fact, did not have its ambassador in India for a few years. And earlier this year, in May of 2024, after 18 months of absence, China sent its ambassador back to India. And then right before the summit in October, they signed this historic agreement. So this is a very important sign because it shows that while the US is trying to encourage more divisions in the world, BRICS is trying to bring countries together. Let's not forget that it was China that last year had a historic breakthrough diplomatically. It brokered a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which were at each other's throats for so long because the US had been trying to use Saudi Arabia as an attack dog, as a proxy against Iran. And Saudi Arabia realized this is actually not serving our interests. We need to normalize relations with Iran, especially now considering that China is the largest trading partner of both Iran and Saudi Arabia. They have a lot of interest in deepening their economic integration with China, especially as they try to move away from oil. So Belt and Road offers a lot of opportunities for infrastructure investment. And so the reality is that China helped broker that agreement, and Russia helped to broker this peace breakthrough between China and India. So the BRICS, everywhere they look, the BRICS is trying to encourage peace and diplomacy in what China refers to as win-win cooperation for mutually beneficial development. That's what the BRICS countries are doing. Whereas the US is looking around everywhere it goes and trying to divide and cause war and stoke conflict, like it's doing in Gaza, like it's doing in Lebanon, with war against them, attacks on Iran, attacks on Yemen, attacks on Iraq, attacks on Syria, and of course the proxy war in Ukraine. Another important thing that was discussed at the Kazan summit was proposals for peace in Ukraine. And China and also Brazil, of course, founding members of BRICS, have a peace plan to try to bring about peace in Ukraine. And of course, the West, the US-led West, has opposed the peace plan because, as the de facto EU foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, said, he said there's only one solution, which is a military solution to the war in Ukraine. They don't believe in peace. And we have so much evidence now showing that the US-led West has sabotaged every single attempt to try to broker peace, going back to the talks that were held in the beginning of this new stage of the Ukraine war in the spring of 2022 in Istanbul and also in Belarus. There were talks, and we now know that the US-led West sabotaged those peace talks, that Russia wanted to sign an agreement that said Ukraine would not join NATO and would be neutral, and they said no. Instead, they said, we're going to send hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine to fight a proxy war in the name of what U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, a former member of the board of directors of weapons corporation Raytheon, Lloyd Austin said the goal of NATO is to weaken Russia. So they're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, just as like they're willing to sacrifice all of Palestinians to try to maintain U.S. hegemony over West Asia. And now they're risking a war with China to support separatist extremists in Taiwan. So everywhere the U.S. is active, it's stoking conflicts and violence and war. And BRICS, on the other hand, is trying to do everything it can to foster stability and diplomacy and peace so countries can develop. That's what they're interested in, is, as China puts it, win-win cooperation and mutually beneficial development.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was a great summary of all these events that have been happening. And we are truly living in a historic time. I believe that these are tectonic shifts that are happening right now, and that not only are they happening, they are accelerating. So I want to thank you for joining us today on the China Report. And if you could let our listeners know where they can see more of your work.
Absolutely. Well, one quick thought you mentioned there that we're living in a historic moment. Of course, there's a quote that's often attributed to Lenin. It's probably apocryphal, but it's a great quote. He supposedly said, "There are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen." And as President Xi Jinping of China has put it repeatedly, one of his favorite phrases recently has been, "We are living in a time where we're seeing changes not seen in 100 years." He famously said that to President Putin, and he's repeated it since. We are seeing changes not seen in 100 years. And President Xi told President Putin, and we are at the center of those changes. And I would add that BRICS is at the center of those changes. Now, as for people who want to get more information about BRICS and all of these very important things happening, of course, everyone should check out Breakthrough and subscribe to what we're watching here. But you can also check out my channel if you go to Geopolitical Economy Report. And if you go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, you can find links to all of my work and all of the other platforms. So thanks so much for the great work that you do. I love Breakthrough. I love your show, and keep it up.
And thank you, Ben. So we're going to share you some clips of Chinese martial artists performing on the streets of Paris. This happened earlier this summer during the Olympics. Martial arts are colloquially referred to as Kung Fu, a Chinese term meaning great accomplishment through hard work.